Let's speak now to Dr. Hanan Ashrawi. She's a Palestinian leader, activist and scholar and joins us from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. Doctor, we really appreciate you coming onto the channel and speaking to us. Just tell us, why is the international community not doing more here, especially when we see these gross human rights violations being carried out, not just in the last few days by Israel, but for several years now?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the international community has done nothing in order to enforce the respect for international law, in order to treat the Palestinians with equal rights as everybody else, in order to hold Israel accountable, in order to put an end to this lethal situation. They were quite happy to just carry out or publish statements of denunciation and disapproval. But when it comes to concrete action, to deal with the root causes of the problem, they are timid, they are reticent at best. At worst, of course, they are complicit with Israel to the degree where they become partners in crime with Israel, like Trump did. Now, with the Biden administration, of course, they wanted to ignore this, hoping it'll go away and hoping that Israel will manage the situation or the occupation without any kind of intervention or curbs. Mm-hmm. So, within the international community, Israel, and particularly the West, Israel remains sort of a colonial outpost in many ways. It is the product of a Western colonial mentality that created Israel on Palestinian land. And therefore, they hold it within a very special esteem, as though it can do no wrong, or if it does anything wrong, you either blame the victim or you are satisfied only with verbal expressions of disapproval. So this is it. This colonial outpost continues to exist and continues to act in ways that defy and violate international law, and it continues to have a free hand against the Palestinians. And it is this impunity and this ongoing refusal to hold Israel to account by all standards is what is causing all these escalations. And I think unless the root causes are addressed, unless Israel is held to account, unless the occupation ends, there will be no peace when you have an abnormal situation of cruelty and control, like the occupation that Israel is exercising against the Palestinians, stealing our land and resources, demolishing our homes, building more settlements, creating a Jewish supremacist racist system even within Israel against the Palestinians, and feeling that it has a free hand to target our holy sites. Look at what it's doing with Al-Aqsa Mosque, and Jerusalem itself, carrying out the ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem, and sweeping annexation to transform its character, its history, its identity. So unless Israel is curbed and held to account, this will continue and escalate, because no people on earth will accept to live under domination, under occupation, and under a brutal system of captivity and control.
And Doctor, you talk about this colonialism and this colonial mindset, and that's been something that's been for the past year, and I want to say since George Floyd's murder, that more and more people have been talking about. And when we look at the momentum of the protests at the moment, it's not just in Gaza or occupied East Jerusalem or in the West Bank, it's everywhere, and it's extending all around the world. Do you feel this is a turning point in the Palestinian struggle, especially when we look at the fact that when it comes to social media, more young people are taking up the cause and becoming involved in something that they may not have even been aware of, and many people equating it to the Black Lives Matter movement?
Yes, absolutely, because in many ways, I mean, knowledge is responsibility, and Israel cannot repeat the 1947-48 massacres and expulsions and so on in the dark. Now, people are beginning to know. There are newer generations. There is a rising network of solidarity throughout the world, yes. And they are expressing their own support. But what's very important is the Palestinian unity now, regardless of the nature of the oppression under which Palestinians live, whether they live in the West Bank and Jerusalem under this brutal occupation, or whether they live in Gaza besieged and pounded and shelled and killed, or whether they live within Israel under a systemically racist, discriminatory administration or system, or whether they live in exile or in refugee camps. You can see them now moving together, Palestinian Americans, Palestinian Europeans, along with their allies, including Jewish allies, people who are seeing what's happening, what's wrong, and they have reintroduced Palestine into the global conversation of rights and freedom and human dignity and integrity.
And Doctor, you talk about Palestinian unity there, but do Palestinians feel supported by other Arab countries, especially after the signing of the Abrahamic Accords, which saw some countries normalize relations with Israel?
Well, if you look at the footage coming out of Gaza and of Jerusalem, and actually there have been confrontations and assaults on Palestinians everywhere in the West Bank, you will see what these Arab regimes have normalized with. They have normalized with the occupation, with discrimination, with Islamophobia, with racism, with hate, with violence. And Israel has been trying to normalize this for a long time, to maintain its brutal control over the Palestinians and at the same time to get the rewards of the Arabs sort of aligning themselves with the Israeli occupation and Israeli brutality. This has, of course, weakened the Palestinians, but now it has clearly exposed these regimes' positions as being also not just immoral and illegal, but also as going against the will of their own people. We have seen how the Arab people came out. We are getting messages of support, of solidarity, of commiseration, a sense that they feel helpless in the face of this Israeli onslaught, and that they are extremely unhappy with normalization. We get messages from every country which normalized, or I don't want to say country, these are regimes that have normalized with Israel and with the occupation and its impunity. And they feel not just embarrassed, but they are angry at their own leadership, at their own regimes. So yes, it has weakened us in many ways, but it has also weakened the regimes. It has exposed them to their own people and to the rest, to the region and to the rest of the world, as people who are opportunistic, interested only in their own self-interest, and in many ways letting down or betraying, if you will, the Palestinian people and cause. But the Palestinian people are resilient, despite decades of oppression and injustice and suffering. We're not going anywhere, and we're not going to surrender or succumb. And as I said, no matter what happens, the Israelis cannot normalize the occupation. Mm-hmm. The Israelis cannot normalize the dispossession of the Palestinians. They cannot normalize Islamophobia and racism. They cannot normalize the dehumanization of the Palestinians. Mm-hmm. So sooner or later, this will happen because there's a momentum and there's an incremental process now.
Yes, and now we just wait for a tipping point.
We can't wait. We have to act, and we need voices, and we need witnesses, and we need advocacy in order to expose what's happening. Because as I said earlier, knowledge is a responsibility. And social media are telling people this is what's happening. And of course, there are many who are engaging in a very positive, supportive way.
Doctor, I'm just going to squeeze in one more question. We're running out of time very quickly, but this idea of a two-state solution has really been thrown around for many years as an answer to what's happening there. Do you think that is the solution?
Well, it is no longer possible, unfortunately, because the whole world stood by and watched Israel destroy the two-state solution. Actually, by giving it time and room and space in order to carry out its policies. And now that it's over, they come and say, well, what creative ideas do you have? But what is clear now is that the Palestinian people are one. Israel now, with its systemic racism against the Palestinians, the indigenous people of Israel, who were there before Israel was created, in support now of the, not just solidarity as one nation, as one community with Palestinians everywhere. This has in many ways blurred the divide, and it has showed that no matter what happens, Israel as a racist, Jewish, supremacist, exclusivist state will not accept any kind of Palestinian humanity or equality or rights, no matter what. And so it is blurring the divide. It is saying within this historical Palestine, within this land, there are Palestinian Christians and Muslims, and there were Palestinian Jews, by the way. It was pluralistic for a long time before Zionism decided that Judaism is a religion, so is a nationality. So anyway, that it has, ironically, this provocation, this escalation, particularly by Netanyahu, has proven that the Palestinians are one nation and one people with rights, and that Israel cannot continue to be a rogue state or a bastion state that is self-enclosed and exclusivist and acting against international law. So in some ways, yes, the one-state solution, despite the fact that it is painful, it is not a one-state yet, it's an apartheid system, as you know, carrying out war crimes and crimes against humanity. Yet ultimately, this is the de facto outcome.
Dr. Hanan Ashrawi, it's been fantastic speaking to you and getting your insight on this. Thank you for joining us. Live to us there from Ramallah.